Okay, we've got our smoothed sculpture here, ready for texture. So I'm going to start laying in some fur. I'll just jump right in here. I'm going to tackle detailing the head first, but even before that, I'm going to lay on some fur texture on the neck. And I will be using my thin wire loop tool, the Kemper tool, and I'm just going to start lightly mapping in some hairs. Now, this isn't necessarily going to be my final texture, but doing this to start out with really helps me get a general layout of the direction and the flow of the texture. So I'm going to go back in later and add some variety through various different methods, but starting out this way really gives me a kind of a game plan and helps me stay moving in the right direction with my texture. And I really like this tool to sculpt fur and a lot of other textures too, because it creates nice soft lines. Whereas, let's say I was going to use like this needle tool, marking those in the really harsh and deep lines. And I really want to go for a softer look on something like fur. So you just want to take into consideration the muscle as well as just the overall form that you're sculpting on. This is definitely a good point to have reference photos out so you can look at the direction of how fur flows and moves and the different lengths depending on the area of the body it's on. Okay. So now that I got the layout of the fur on the neck, I'm going to go ahead and move into the face and do a similar mapping. And the fur on the face is going to be relatively shorter than what I had on the neck. Over on the cheeks there, it's going to be a little longer so it blends into the neck fur. So now that I'm adding texture, you can see why I did not bother to get things completely smooth during the refinement phase, because I'm just going back and sculpting over top of that. It's actually even nice to have a little unevenness to the surface and adds a little more variety to the texture. So again, this is just the initial layout of the fur. I'm going to go back and add some more variety. And I'm also, in this guy's case, he's got leaves all over his body too. So I'm going to be adding those in. And when you get to areas like the tip of the nose, the hairs may be so short that you don't even want to sculpt them in. And just kind of smooth them out. Fur is really a texture that you have to keep going back over and adding variety, adding definition, changing some of the lines. It's not really a once over and then done kind of deal. To get it looking natural, you really gotta go back in and add variety, smooth out some areas so you're not seeing every single little hair. That can just look busy and unnatural. Because if you think about when you're looking at something like fur, your eye doesn't really perceive every single hair. So the idea is to give the impression of fur rather than recreating the actual texture itself. And that's going to be true with all textures. Okay. So on this guy, where there would be longer fur, like on the underside of the neck, and on the cheek tufts, he's actually going to have leaves. The technique I'm going to use to sculpt the leaves can be used to sculpt longer fur as well. So kind of start at the base of the neck here, and I'm just using these flat, tapered shapes. I'll press it into place there, where I smooth in the base of the shape into the body, and then I've got the tip that's got the definition on it. I'm going to kind of create these in layers. With a texture like fur, you really want to think about the fact that it grows out of the skin and doesn't lay flat on top of it. So you really want to create that impression of depth. You know, right now, when I mapped out the texture, it looks very flat. There's no real dimension to it. It looks like I drew lines on top of him, so it's time to go back and make it look more like fur. With these shapes I'm putting into place, the leaves, I'm going to be leaving these smooth and flat so that they look like leaves, but you can use this same technique, this overlapping technique here, and then use it to create longer hair. So it looks like hair clumps. So instead of just leaving it smooth like I'm doing there, you could just go back with the tool and start adding line work in that. Which I'm going to be doing to blend the leaves into the fur. So we'll see some more of that in a little bit. Another texture you can use this technique for is scales and feathers. Very similar start, just with a different finish. But you'll notice a lot of texture work is really rooted in the same idea, or the same start, just kind of branches off into different directions, especially textures like fur, hair, and scales and feathers. And And these are going to decrease in size as they move up towards the face. That's going to give a nice even transition into the shorter fur. I'll be going back into refining these, but I just want to get the basic layout in. And you can see here on the back of the neck, I want it to taper out into, or transition into the plain fur texture. So I'm starting to let them dissipate as they go back there. So I like to seal up those seams between the pieces there. Don't like to have too much of the clay hanging off the sculpture so it doesn't break off easily once this is baked. If I have a texture I want to be a little more dynamic, or any element of a sculpture, like crest feathers or anything that's going to be protruding off the sculpture, I will often sculpt those with epoxy sculpt or enhance them with epoxy sculpt once this is baked, and that will make for a stronger finish. I might end up doing that with these, but we'll see how things go. He's going to have crest feathers along the back. Those might be good for epoxy sculpt. Going back and adding some texture into these clumps up here. It's going to be more fur up here rather than the leaves. I do want to have some of those leaves in there. Maybe some smaller ones. Also a good time to check your sculpture from the front and make sure he's looking poofy enough from the side. It's a technical term. So in my case, I'm going to be bulking out some of these hair tufts because they're just not sticking out quite as much as I'd like them to. And notice I'm still keeping everything really rough because I know that I'm going to be adjusting a bunch before this is all said and done. And notice that I've been turning my sculpture as I texture. That's just so I get a better angle on the texture. Since I'm right-handed, it's easier for me to come at the sculpture from the right side, and sometimes in order to get the line strokes how I want them, turning the sculpture, rather than trying to sculpt everything from the same angle, helps get a more even look. So another reason to be turning your sculpture constantly, to make things easier for yourself. Okay, I'm going to jump into the face and get some of those cheek tuft leaves on there. So just like with the neck fur, I'm going to be laying in some shapes. And this is the exact same technique you would use to make the longer fur here. I'm just going to be making leaves since he is a plant creature. Notice I started up larger up here, and then as it's going down the jawline, they're getting a little smaller. You do the same thing with fur. He's also got some leaves along his brow ridge. So I'm going to do those next. Very similar fashion. I'm going to go back in and retool some of that fur that got erased when I was placing leaves. Nice to switch it back and forth between the two sides. Just coming back to this side, I can see the areas that need more attention. Sometimes if you work too long on one area without moving to another area, you just get a little too focused, and it's hard to see when you're making mistakes, or it's hard to see the areas that need improvement. But if you change gears and switch to another area of the sculpture and then come back, chances are you'll have a much easier time seeing where you need to put your attention. Right now I'm just slowly building up areas that need a little bit more. So this is going to be a very time-intensive process. It's not a quick thing. When we're doing the initial phase of the sculpture, that block out, that's when you want to move really quick. And then as you move further along in the process, that's when you start to slow down and just really work to get things looking right. Looking at it from many different angles. Don't be afraid to just say this isn't working and just erasing what you did and starting from scratch. Sometimes that's the best way to go. It can be frustrating because you did all that hard work, but sometimes trying to undo or trying to fix bad work or wrong work just is going to take so much more time than if you had just scrapped it and started over. So it happens to all of us. Also checking back and forth between the sides to get things looking relatively even. Don't want it to be a mirror image of the other side, but should still be relatively symmetrical. For the inside of the ears, I'm going to lay in some strips of clay to add some fluff in there so they're not quite so flat looking. can use my loop tool to go in and add the texture. Kind of break up that fur texture a little bit more. This is a great way to add some stray hairs or stray clumps in fur texture as well. Rather than leaving them as smooth leaves like I'm doing, you would just go and texture over top, which I might end up doing on a couple of these. And the texture is starting to come together here. As you can see, I've made a lot of passes going back and forth. I'm going to go ahead and lay in the crest feathers that are going to go along the back and the top of the head. So I'm going to draw in a center line so I have a guide to follow along. And I'm going to start at the base of the neck and work my way up, since this is like the bottom of the stack down here, as I like to call it. So I'll start with the smallest, and they're going to get a little bigger each one. I could put these on wires as well to make them a little bit stronger, or use epoxy sculpt here. But for now, I'm just going to do straight up Sculpey. I might go back later after he's baked and replace some of these with epoxy sculpt. We'll see how things go. I have options. But at least for now, these will be a nice placeholder for me to kind of have a reference point. So I think I'm going to go ahead and jump to the tail for a bit. I like to do the head first and then move on to the tail and limbs, just leaving the torso for last. If you notice, that's where I've been holding him as I'm working, so I don't want to texture that area in the beginning because I'll just ruin all my work. So I saved the torso for last. And I'm going to be doing the same thing here where I map out the texture first and then go back to enhance and add more definition. He's going to have more of the leaves and some swirls, like little baby ferns on his tail, so that'll be fun. I'm doing some longer furs on the tip of the tail. Don't want every hair to be the same length. Be a little shorter near where the tail joins the body, and then it'll be longer on the underside and near the tip. Neck, I'm adding in those little strips of clay to break up the texture. Some of them will be thicker fur and some of them will end up being leaves. I kind of strategically placed these strips so that they break up the outline a little bit. So now along the top you've got some little tufts sticking up, and the same with the bottom, and then the same from the side view as well. I can go back and define those a little more if I find that they're not overlapping the contour or the outline as much as I'd like them to. start adding in some of the swirls, kind of like baby ferns. And you can see I'm just laying them in place and then sort of blending them into the fur. The nice thing about Sculpey is you don't have to do a whole lot to get pieces of itself to adhere to each other. Kind of just press things into place and it'll stay there. On the backs of the ears, I'm going to add some of those swirls as well. While I'm thinking of it. And we are going to finish with the detail in the next video.